When the moving trucks finally left and the quiet of the neighborhood settled in again, the family across the street thought everything would return to normal. The tidy cul-de-sacs of Willow Creek were known for their perfectly trimmed lawns, their gleaming SUV in spotless driveways, and their reputation as one of the most well-managed HOA communities in the county. Newcomers were always expected to blend in quickly, to adopt the same neat, suburban rhythm. But my arrival was slightly different. Unlike most homeowners, I brought with me a small flock of backyard chickens. 6 hens, carefully raised, well-fed, and kept in a coop I had built by hand. The coop was neat, clean, and tucked at the back corner of my yard where the wooden privacy fence shielded it from direct view. I had done my research thoroughly before moving into Willow Creek, and I knew the HOA bylaws inside and out. It wasn't that chickens were banned outright. Most people assumed they were, but rather there was a specific clause hidden deep in the HOA documents that allowed the keeping of small, non-commercial fowl for personal use, provided certain conditions were met. I had those conditions covered. No roosters, only hens. A maximum of 6 birds. The coop had to be at least 20 feet from any neighboring property line. And above all, it had to be kept sanitary and free of odors or noise that might disturb the peace. I followed each rule carefully, ensuring my hens were quiet and their space spotless. To me, they were more than egg producers. They were part of a lifestyle I had always dreamed of: self-sufficiency, sustainability, and a connection to something real in the middle of manicured suburbia. For the first few weeks, there were no issues. The hens scratched in their pen, clucked softly as they laid eggs, and the neighbors who noticed were quietly curious but not concerned. Some even came by, asking questions or expressing fascination that anyone in Willow Creek had dared bring a piece of farm life into the neighborhood. A couple of children were delighted, their eyes lighting up as I let them collect eggs from the nesting boxes. Everything seemed peaceful, that was, until Karen noticed. Karen was the kind of neighbor who appointed herself guardian of Willow Creek's standards. Her house, sitting directly adjacent to mine, was always spotless, with seasonal wreaths on the door and flower beds trimmed with near-military precision. She saw herself as the neighborhood watch, though no one had ever asked her to take that role. If a car parked too close to the sidewalk, Karen wrote down the license plate. If holiday lights stayed up one day too long, she documented it. And when she finally caught sight of my hens through the narrow gap between our fences, she acted as if she had uncovered a crime in progress. From that day forward, I noticed her behavior shift. Her blinds would twitch whenever I walked into the backyard. She lingered longer than necessary while checking her mail, clearly waiting for any sound from the coop. And one evening, I overheard her muttering loudly enough for me to hear across the fence about farm animals ruining the neighborhood. It didn't take long for her to escalate her disapproval into action. One Monday morning, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, written in the stiff, bureaucratic tone they always used, informing me that a formal complaint had been filed against my property. The letter accused me of violating community rules by keeping livestock in a residential area, and it ordered me to remove the chickens immediately or face fines. The letter was signed with the HOA seal of authority, and at the bottom, in a neat italic script, it noted that the complaint had been submitted by a neighbor. I didn't need to guess who. Karen had gone straight to the HOA, likely expecting them to march onto my property and demand I dismantle the coop that same day. She must have felt triumphant as she dropped the complaint into their hands, certain that she was protecting the character of the neighborhood. She didn't know what I knew. She hadn't read the rules as thoroughly as I had. And most importantly, she didn't realize that I had something she didn't expect, a special exemption written into my deed when I purchased the house. Years ago, before Willow Creek was built into the sprawling suburban enclave it had become, this land had been zoned differently. A few properties retained grandfathered rights that allowed certain agricultural practices rights that carried over even when the HOA took control. My house was one of them. My realtor had been meticulous about pointing this out, and I had confirmed it in writing before signing anything. On top of that, the HOA-owned bylaws mirrored the same allowance for small, personal use flocks, though most residents had never noticed because the document was over 100 pages long. Instead of panicking, I carefully filed the letter away, already planning how I would respond. Days later, a notice came summoning me to a formal HOA hearing. Karen's complaint had been escalated to the board, and they intended to discuss it in person. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out, giving me plenty of time to prepare. I imagined Karen at home, rehearsing her outrage, maybe even gathering allies from other neighbors who disliked anything that didn't conform perfectly to their vision of suburban uniformity. What she didn't realize was that she had set in motion something that would backfire spectacularly. I had every intention of walking into that meeting with documentation, proof, and calm assurance. Karen believed she had cornered me. But in reality, she had just handed me the perfect opportunity to expose how little she actually understood about the rules she claimed to protect. And so, as the days ticked closer to the hearing, the stage was quietly being set. Karen was preparing for a public victory. I was preparing for something far more satisfying. The neighborhood drama was only just beginning. In the 2 weeks leading up to the HOA hearing, the atmosphere in Willow Creek began to shift. What had once been a quiet, orderly suburb was now slowly filling with whispers and rumors. Karen, never one to let an opportunity for attention slip by, had begun her own campaign. To her, the chickens weren't just a minor violation, they were a threat to the entire prestige of the neighborhood, and she was determined to rally others to her side. Her methods were predictable, almost theatrical. She began making her rounds during evening walks, approaching neighbors with the same disapproving scowl and a voice that carried over hedges and driveways. She described the chickens in dramatic tones, exaggerating every detail. According to her, the hens were noisy, filthy, and a health hazard. She warned parents that diseases could spread to their children, and claimed that rats would inevitably follow. The more she spoke, the more the story twisted, until the hens had been transformed from 6 quiet layers into a plague upon the community. For some neighbors, Karen's words took root. They were the type who never questioned anything as long as it was delivered with enough conviction. Others remained neutral, brushing off her concerns or quietly rolling their eyes. A few even came to me privately, curious about the truth, and I welcomed them into my backyard to see the coop with their own eyes. They left reassured, sometimes even impressed at how tidy everything was. But Karen was relentless, and she played to her audience well. By the time the HOA meeting loomed closer, a divide had formed. Some houses displayed quiet support for Karen, offering sympathetic nods as she passed. Others stayed out of it entirely, choosing silence rather than confrontation. I knew Karen believed she was gaining momentum, that she saw herself as the champion of protecting property values. What she didn't realize was that the more noise she made, the more obvious her personal vendetta became. Meanwhile, I prepared quietly, methodically. I gathered every piece of paperwork I could find, the HOA bylaws, highlighted and tabbed for quick reference, my property deed with the grandfathered clause clearly marked, photographs of the coop, from multiple angles, showing its compliance with setbacks and sanitation requirements. I even went as far as collecting testimonials from neighbors who had no complaints, written statements that confirmed the chickens were neither disruptive nor offensive. The more Karen spread her exaggerated tales, the more confident I became. She was painting herself into a corner, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to let her overstep. As the day of the hearing drew closer, Karen escalated her theatrics. She began leaving flyers in mailboxes, crudely printed sheets, warning about barnyard animals in Willow Creek, and urging residents to attend the meeting to demand their removal. The flyers included dramatic stock images of dirty coops, screeching roosters, and disease-looking birds, none of which bore any resemblance to the 6 healthy hens in my yard. The intent was clear. Karen wanted a spectacle, and a spectacle was exactly what she was going to get, though not in the way she imagined. On the evening of the meeting, the HOA clubhouse was fuller than usual. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the hum of chatter filled the air. I walked in calmly, carrying a neat folder of documents under my arm. Karen was already there, seated near the front, her posture stiff with anticipation. She had gathered a small cluster of supporters around her, neighbors who nodded along as she whispered to them. When she saw me enter, her eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of someone who believed the end was already decided. The HOA board sat at a long table facing the crowd, papers stacked neatly before them. They wore their usual expressions of weary authority, people who had seen more than their fair share of petty disputes, but still treated every case with exaggerated seriousness. Karen had submitted her complaint in writing, but now she had the chance to present it in person. She wasted no time. As soon as the board gave her the floor, she launched into a dramatic speech, painting the chickens as a scourge on the neighborhood. She spoke of noise that shattered the peace, of smells that drifted into her yard, of the unsanitary conditions she claimed were inevitable. She even went so far as to suggest that the presence of chickens would lower everyone's property values, a phrase that seemed to carry weight with a few nodding heads in the crowd. Her performance was elaborate, full of dramatic pauses and exaggerated sighs. She presented herself as the voice of reason, the lone defender of community standards. By the time she sat down, her cheeks were flushed, and she looked expectantly toward the board, as though certain they were about to declare her victorious. That was when it was my turn. I stood, calm and composed, and began presenting my side. My voice was steady, my tone respectful. I explained how many hens I had, how the coop was maintained, and how I had carefully followed every single requirement listed in the HOA bylaws. I handed over copies of the deed, with the grandfathered clause clearly highlighted. I pointed to the relevant passages in the HOA own rules, proving that chickens were not only allowed, but specifically accounted for. Then I produced photographs, clear, high-resolution images of the coop, the hens, and the surrounding yard. Each one showed cleanliness, compliance, and order. I laid out written statements from neighbors who had no complaints, directly contradicting Karen's claims of noise or odor. Piece by piece, the exaggerated picture Karen had painted began to crumble. The board studied the documents, whispering quietly among themselves. The crowd shifted uneasily, some clearly realizing for the first time that Karen's story might not hold up. I could see her stiffen in her chair, her jaw tightening as each piece of evidence stacked against her. But I wasn't finished. Finally, I calmly presented the exemption clause from my deed. It was undeniable, written into the very property itself. Even if the HOA wanted to reinterpret their own bylaws, they had no authority to override what had been legally recorded. The board members' expressions changed at that moment, from skeptical consideration to reluctant acceptance. The decision was practically made. Karen, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She shifted forward in her seat, preparing to argue again. The hearing was far from over, but the balance of power had already tipped, and for the first time Karen realized she wasn't the one in control. The neighborhood drama was about to reach its breaking point. The HOA hearing should have ended there. The documents I presented were clear, the exemption undeniable, and the bylaws themselves supported my case. Any reasonable board would have closed the matter, issued a statement of compliance, and moved on to the next agenda item. But reason and Karen had never lived comfortably together. As the board members conferred quietly at the head table, Karen shot up from her seat, unable to contain herself. Her voice, sharp and shrill, cut through the room before anyone could stop her. She accused the board of being biased, of ignoring the silent majority, of residents who supposedly wanted the chickens gone. She claimed my photographs were staged, my neighbors' statements coerced, and my exemption nothing more than a loophole that should never have been allowed. The room grew tense. Neighbors shifted in their seats, some uncomfortable with her fury, others secretly entertained. Karen's face reddened as she leaned forward, her hands gripping the back of the chair in front of her, as if sheer willpower could bend the board to her side. The board president, a man known for his calm but weary demeanor, tried to regain control. He reminded Karen that the process had to be respected, that the evidence was valid, and that the HOA responsibility was to uphold the actual rules, not interpretations fueled by personal opinion. But Karen only grew louder, her words spiraling into accusations that the board was weak, that they were letting farmers invade their pristine neighborhood. It was no longer about chickens. It was about Karen's pride. The more she ranted, the more obvious it became to everyone in the room that this wasn't about community standards at all. It was about one woman's obsession with control. The neighbors who had once nodded along to her warnings now looked uneasy. Some avoided her gaze altogether, while others whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Finally, the board president called the meeting back to order. He announced that the evidence I had presented was thorough and sufficient. My chickens were not in violation of the bylaws, nor of my deed's exemption. The board would not pursue enforcement, and the matter was considered closed. The gavel came down, a simple, final sound that should have ended everything. But for Karen, it was a declaration of war. She stood frozen in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. The board had ruled against her, but in her mind, that didn't mean she had lost. It only meant she had to find another way to win. Without a word, she gathered her belongings, rose sharply, and stormed out of the clubhouse. The sound of the door slamming echoed behind her, leaving a silence that lingered long after. In the days that followed, Karen's campaign against me took on new forms. If she couldn't win officially, she would try to make my life difficult in every other way possible. Small things began happening, trash bags left near my curb, loud music played at odd hours, sprinklers mysteriously shifted so that water sprayed toward my fence line. Nothing serious enough to report, but persistent enough to remind me that Karen wasn't done. She also started spreading new rumors. According to her, the board had been manipulated, pressured into siding with me to avoid conflict. She claimed corruption, favoritism, and even hinted that I had bribed someone. Though her accusations were baseless, they found receptive ears among the few neighbors still willing to believe her every word. But the more she pushed, the more cracks showed in her image. People who had once admired her vigilance began to tire of the drama. Parents who had initially worried about chickens now wondered aloud if maybe Karen was exaggerating. And some even began to see me not as the rule breaker Karen described, but as the calm neighbor who had handled himself with patience and facts while Karen unraveled in public. Her obsession, however, was far from over. Late one evening, I caught her standing near the side of her yard, glaring through the slats of the fence at the coop. The hens clucked softly, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Karen's silhouette lingered long after she thought no one was watching, her posture stiff with resentment. It became clear that Karen wasn't satisfied with trying to sway the HOA or neighbors anymore. She wanted a personal victory, something tangible that would prove she was right all along. And as I went about my daily routine, tending the coop, collecting eggs, maintaining the yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something more. The battle over chickens had moved beyond paperwork and meetings. It was now a clash of wills, one that would test not just the rules of the neighborhood, but the patience and resilience of everyone caught in the crossfire. And Karen, unwilling to admit defeat, was about to escalate the conflict in ways no one could have predicted. When Karen realized that the HOA wouldn't bend to her will, she turned her attention outward. If the board couldn't, or wouldn't force me to remove the chickens, then she would find someone who could. And so began her campaign of outside interference, a crusade that dragged city officials, animal control, and even the police into the neighborhood drama. The first incident came on a Saturday morning, just as I was finishing up cleaning the coop. A white van pulled up in front of my house, its sides marked with the seal of the county's Animal Services Department. Two officers stepped out, clipboards in hand, their expressions professional but mildly weary, as though they had been down this road before. They explained they had received an anonymous complaint about livestock being kept in a residential area. The phrasing was familiar. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I calmly walked them through the yard, showing them the coop, the hens, and the pristine condition of the setup. I provided them with copies of the exemption clause and the HOA bylaws that permitted the chickens. After a thorough inspection, the officers nodded, satisfied. There was nothing illegal, nothing unsanitary, nothing even remotely concerning. By the time they left, one of them even commented on how impressed he was by the cleanliness and organization of the coop. Their report closed the case the moment they got back to the office. Karen must have been watching from her window. The sight of the officers leaving without taking action must have stung, because only a few days later, another vehicle arrived. This time, a city code enforcement officer. The complaint was the same, livestock in a residential zone, and once again the result was identical. The officer reviewed the paperwork, confirmed the exemption, and left. Karen wasn't satisfied. Weeks passed, and the visits continued. A police cruiser pulled up one evening after yet another anonymous call, this one claiming there were disturbances coming from my yard. The officer, clearly reluctant to be there, listened to the hens clucking softly in their pen and shook his head. He told me there was no violation, no reason for concern, and left with an apology for the wasted time. It became a pattern, complaint after complaint, agency after agency. Each one came, inspected, and left empty-handed. My paperwork, my coop, and my compliance with the rules protected me at every turn, but the repeated disruptions revealed something far more telling. Karen's obsession was spiraling into desperation. The neighborhood took notice. At first, some residents assumed the repeated visits meant there must be something wrong. But after the fifth or sixth time, the truth became clear. This wasn't about chickens at all. It was about Karen's inability to accept that she had lost. The once proud, self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek, was now becoming a spectacle herself, a source of gossip whispered over fences and across driveways. Still, Karen refused to let go. One night, around midnight, I caught the beam of a flashlight sweeping across my backyard. The hens stirred in their coop as I stepped outside, only to see Karen retreating quickly into the shadows of her own yard. She had been snooping, hoping to find something she could use against me. The sight of her skulking through the dark, clutching her flashlight like a weapon, only cemented how far she was willing to go. But her persistence had consequences she hadn't considered. The more she involved outside authorities, the more documentation piled up. Every report filed by Animal Services, Code Enforcement, or the police became part of a paper trail that showed not my guilt, but my innocence. And every unnecessary call wasted official resources, something the agencies themselves did not take lightly. Eventually, a city official reached out to the HOA board directly, warning them that repeated false complaints could be considered harassment. The HOA, already weary of Karen's antics, now had even more reason to view her as a liability rather than an asset. The tables were turning faster than Karen realized. What she saw as a series of strategic moves was, in reality, digging her deeper into a hole. Her neighbors whispered about her behavior, the board grew tired of her constant interference, and the agencies she called began to view her as a nuisance rather than a concerned citizen. For me, the chickens continued their quiet lives, blissfully unaware of the storm raging around them. Each morning, I collected fresh eggs, tended to the coop, and went about my routine. It was almost comical. 6 hens, minding their own business, had managed to expose the unraveling of one neighbor's carefully crafted reputation. But Karen wasn't finished. If authorities and rules couldn't bring her the victory she wanted, she would find another path. One that would push the neighborhood conflict into uncharted territory. The drama was about to reach its most explosive stage. By the time the false complaints had piled up, most of Willow Creek had grown weary of Karen's crusade. What had started as a neighborhood scandal had turned into something closer to a comedy of errors. Neighbors chuckled about the endless visits from city officials, shaking their heads at how Karen seemed determined to chase shadows. But while many laughed, Karen seethed. To her, every failed attempt only deepened the sting of humiliation. She had staked her reputation on the idea that she could save the neighborhood, and now that reputation was crumbling. She wasn't the protector of property values anymore. She was the spectacle, the woman who wouldn't let go of a grudge over 6 harmless hens. Her desperation led her to a final, reckless plan. It happened one bright Saturday morning. Families were outside tending their lawns. Kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalks, and I was in the backyard, scattering feed for the hens. That's when Karen made her move. She emerged from her house with a clipboard in hand, striding down the street as though she were on official business. She began knocking on doors. At each house, she spoke animatedly, waving her clipboard, urging neighbors to sign a petition to remove my chickens. Her words carried across the cul-de-sac, filled with her usual exaggerations, claims of disease, of noise, of plummeting property values. She described the hens as farm animals overrunning a suburban community, and insisted it was up to the residents to take matters into their own hands since the HOA and city had failed them. At first, a few neighbors humored her. Some signed just to get her off their doorstep, while others politely declined. But as Karen's voice grew louder, as her tone sharpened and her accusations became wilder, more and more people began to resist. One neighbor asked if she had actually seen any problems herself, beyond her personal dislike. Another pointed out that the repeated visits from authorities had found nothing wrong. Karen's face reddened, and she accused them of being naive, of siding with the rule breaker. The breaking point came when she reached the Martinez family's home. They had 2 young children who often came to my yard to see the chickens, delighting in collecting eggs. When Karen demanded they sign her petition, Mrs. Martinez calmly refused. That refusal sent Karen into a rage. She raised her voice, accusing the Martinezes of endangering their children by letting them near diseased animals. Her shouting echoed down the street, loud enough to draw more neighbors out of their houses. Soon, a small crowd gathered. Some crossed their arms, frowning at Karen's tirade. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even pulled out their phones, quietly recording the scene. And then Karen made the mistake that sealed her fate. In her fury, she stormed into my front yard, waving her clipboard, and began shouting toward my backyard. She declared loudly that if no one else would protect the neighborhood, then she would take matters into her own hands. She marched up to my fence, rattled the gate, and threatened to remove the chickens herself. The hens startled at the noise, flapping and clucking in alarm. I stepped out just in time to see Karen yanking on the latch, her face twisted with determination. Before I could even speak, a neighbor's voice rang out across the cul-de-sac. "Enough, Karen." It was the crack in the dam. The neighbors, tired of weeks of drama, turned against her all at once. Voices rose, calling her out for harassment, for wasting everyone's time, for making the neighborhood miserable. Some shouted for her to go back inside, while others pointed out that she was trespassing on my property. Someone mentioned the word police, and suddenly Karen froze, realizing how far she had gone. But it was too late. Multiple phones had captured everything: her shouting, her threats, her attempt to break into my yard. The evidence was undeniable, and it spread quickly through the neighborhood's group chat. By that evening, nearly every resident had seen the video of Karen's meltdown. Her petition was worthless. Instead of rallying support, she had exposed herself as the problem. The HOA, embarrassed that one of their residents had created such chaos, convened an emergency session. This time, Karen was the one called to a hearing, not me. Her behavior was deemed harassment. Her repeated false reports labeled as abuse of process, and her attempted trespass noted as a violation of both HOA rules and local law. The same board she once believed was her I now regarded her as a liability. The sanctions were swift. Karen was fined heavily for her actions, warned formally about her conduct, and placed under watch by the HOA for any future violations. The board made it clear, one more incident and they would pursue legal action. For Karen, the humiliation was complete. The neighbors she once lorded over no longer saw her as a leader or watchdog. They saw her as a nuisance, a bully whose obsession had backfired spectacularly. And though she still lived next door, the shift in the community was undeniable. People avoided her, whispered about her, and rolled their eyes whenever her name came up. As for me, I continued with my quiet routine. The hens clucked contentedly, oblivious to the drama they had survived. I collected fresh eggs, shared them with neighbors, and watched as the neighborhood slowly returned to peace, except, of course, for the bitter glare that sometimes still peeked from behind Karen's blinds. But even that glare had lost its power. Karen had fought her war, and she had lost. In the weeks following Karen's meltdown, Willow Creek began to settle into a new kind of quiet. The endless drama, the late night whispering, the parade of city officials, it all came to a sudden halt once the video of her tirade had spread. What had once been a neighborhood divided over chickens had transformed into a neighborhood united by something else entirely: exhaustion with Karen. The HOA sanctions had silenced her, at least in official matters. The hefty fines hit her wallet harder than she expected, and the board's written warning meant any further stunts could escalate into legal trouble. The woman who once thrived on the idea of being the enforcer of rules was now living under the weight of restrictions herself. But more damaging than fines or warnings was her loss of influence. Neighbors who once humored her stopped engaging altogether. Conversations quieted when she approached. Invitations to community barbecues, holiday parties, and block gatherings no longer found their way to her doorstep. When she did appear in public spaces, the air grew tense, and people quickly drifted away. Karen hadn't just lost her battle against the chickens. She had lost the war for social control. The chickens, meanwhile, carried on their simple lives as though nothing had happened. Every morning I collected eggs, their warm shells nestled in my basket. Sometimes I shared them with neighbors, especially the Martinez kids, who still came by with dyed excitement to check the nesting boxes. What had once been a point of controversy had become a small symbol of community instead. The eggs found their way into breakfasts across Willow Creek, and more than one neighbor joked that they tasted like victory. Over time, the hens became a kind of quiet landmark. Visitors would ask, "Are these the famous chickens?" And neighbors would smile knowingly. The very animals Karen had tried to erase became part of the neighborhood's story, a reminder of how absurd things had gotten, and how resilience and patience had won out in the end. As for Karen, her bitterness never faded. She kept her blinds drawn tighter, her yard less immaculate than before. The seasonal wreaths on her door stopped changing with the holidays, and the once perfect flower beds began to show weeds. It was as though the fight had drained her energy, leaving her with nothing but resentment. Occasionally, I'd catch her glaring from her window, but she no longer acted. The HOA warning had caged her more effectively than any fence could have. Months passed, and the memory of the chicken war slowly faded into neighborhood lore. New families moved in, hearing only fragments of the story, enough to laugh about, but not enough to relive. For those of us who had witnessed it, though, the saga stood as a lesson about pride, persistence, and the danger of underestimating a neighbor who had done his homework. What struck me most, in the end, was the irony. Karen had wanted to protect the neighborhood's character, but in her fight against 6 hens, she had exposed her own character instead. Her obsession, her refusal to admit defeat, her willingness to twist rules and harass others, it had all been laid bare for everyone to see. The chickens didn't ruin Willow Creek. Karen's crusade did. For me, the satisfaction wasn't just in keeping the hens, or in winning the battle of paperwork and hearings. It was in knowing I had stood calmly, backed by facts, while Karen's fury consumed her. The victory wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the clucking of hens in a sunlit yard, steady and unbothered. And every time I cracked open a fresh egg, every time I saw a neighbor smile as I handed them a carton, I remembered just how completely Karen had underestimated me. She had called the HOA, rallied the neighbors, dragged in the city, and even tried to break into my yard. And still, at the end of it all, the chickens remained safe, sound, and perfectly within the rules she never bothered to read. The war was over. The chickens had won.